1. Moments ago, a storm erupted between Washington and Downing Street. A clash so fierce that diplomats are calling it the worst breakdown in US-UK relations since the Iraq War. Donald Trump, never one to hold back, publicly humiliated Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in a late-night statement that has already sent shockwaves through NATO headquarters. The words were simple but devastating. The UK isn't pulling its weight, and the American people won't fund Europe's defence any longer. Within minutes, social media exploded. #Trump vs Sunak began trending across both sides of the Atlantic. British officials scrambled for damage control, but the fallout had already begun. NATO insiders leaked that emergency calls were made between Brussels and London. The kind of late-night calls that only happen when global alliances are on the brink of collapse. And all of it traces back to one moment of defiance, one man's refusal to back down. For years, Britain has stood as America's closest ally. Through war, trade and crisis, the special relationship has been a cornerstone of the Western world. But tonight, that foundation cracked. In an unexpected move, Rishi Sunak pushed back, publicly and fiercely accusing Trump of endangering European security for political theatre. It was a line that stunned even his own cabinet, because no British Prime Minister in modern history has spoken to an American president like that. Not Thatcher, not Blair, not Johnson. What followed was chaos. Whitehall insiders describe a communication freeze. American military liaisons temporarily walked out of a joint defence briefing in Brussels. The British pound wobbled overnight, defence stocks plummeted, and questions flooded Parliament. Was NATO collapsing before our eyes? In the corridors of Westminster, panic spread faster than truth. Some MPs whispered that Trump's team had already prepared sanctions, an economic warning shot to punish Britain for its criticism. Others insisted this was mere political theatre designed to test Sunak's loyalty. But the tone coming from Washington told a darker story. Trump's advisors reportedly told journalists off the record the UK needs to decide whether it stands with strength or hides behind old alliances. That line, old alliances, echoed through every newsroom in London. For a nation built on tradition and diplomacy, it sounded like a death sentence. The BBC broke into regular programming. Sky News ran live banners reading, Trump-Sunak rift deepens. Even Buckingham Palace was briefed. Yes, the king himself was reportedly informed of the escalating diplomatic crisis. The monarchy may be symbolic, but the stability of Britain's global image is not. And while the Prime Minister's office released a short, carefully worded statement calling the president's remarks unhelpful, the damage was already done. British intelligence chiefs warned of an information war brewing. Foreign actors spreading disinformation online to deepen the divide. Russia's state media mocked the situation, broadcasting headlines like NATO fractures as London turns on Washington. In Moscow, laughter. In London, fear. But perhaps the most striking reaction came from the British people themselves. Opinion polls taken within hours showed a nation split down the middle. Half the country furious at Trump's arrogance, the other half questioning why Britain should continue to spend billions defending Europe while its own economy struggles. It was no longer just a diplomatic feud. It had become a moral question about who Britain truly is, a loyal partner or a sovereign nation ready to stand alone. Inside Number 10, sources say the mood was grim. Advisors argued behind closed doors. Some urged Sunak to de-escalate, to issue an apology and protect economic ties. Others demanded he stand firm, arguing that backing down now would destroy Britain's credibility on the world stage. The tension was so thick, one official later described it as a standoff that could decide the fate of the Atlantic Alliance. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down. In a follow-up interview, he accused Britain of hiding behind history, suggesting that NATO had become a charity case for nations unwilling to defend themselves. The words were brutal, it's calculated to wound, and they did. Even traditional allies within the Conservative Party were left speechless. By midnight, leaks emerged claiming that Trump had threatened to pull thousands of US troops from Europe if Britain didn't commit to a higher defence budget within weeks. The ultimatum was clear. Either Sunak yields or the alliance burns. That was when the headlines shifted from shock to disbelief. The British press began calling it the transatlantic divorce. Analysts on both sides warned of global instability, with one senior diplomat saying quietly, if London and Washington can't trust each other, the world will change overnight. The morning after the clash, London woke up under a shadow. The air outside Number 10 felt heavier than usual, the press barricades crowded and the faces of ministers grim. Overnight, Britain's diplomatic cables had gone into overdrive. NATO's top officials were demanding clarity, while Washington's tone had turned cold, almost surgical. The special relationship, a phrase politicians once repeated like scripture, now sounded like a memory from a different age. But inside the private halls of Buckingham Palace, a different kind of conversation was taking place. King Charles had been briefed before dawn. Reports say he sat in silence for several minutes, reading the transcripts of Trump's remarks and Sunak's response. Then, with that slow, deliberate composure the world recognises, he said just one line to his advisor: he's playing with fire. Within hours, the palace had reached out quietly, discreetly, using back channels that bypassed the noise of politics. It wasn't about power, it was about stability for the king. This wasn't simply a political row. It was a threat to Britain's identity itself. For centuries, the United Kingdom had built its strength on diplomacy, on balance, on trust. Now, the Crown was watching that heritage unravel in real time. Behind the gilded walls, aides discussed whether a private audience between the King and the Prime Minister might calm the storm. But Sunak, already under siege from within his own cabinet, hesitated. He knew that accepting royal counsel at such a moment might be seen as weakness, and weakness in the age of Trump was fatal. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Trump was basking in the chaos. From his Mar-a-Lago residence, he recorded another statement, one more blistering than before. If Britain can't pay its share, it doesn't deserve America's protection, he declared, smirking before the cameras. We're done carrying freeloaders. The comments spread like wildfire. European markets trembled, the British pound fell again, and in Parliament, murmurs turned into outrage. Opposition leader Keir Starmer took to the floor, accusing the Prime Minister of sleepwalking the country into diplomatic humiliation. The benches erupted in shouting. MPs from all sides demanded answers. What did Trump mean? Was he serious? And if he was, how would Britain respond? By midday, the tension had reached its boiling point. Anonymous sources from inside the Ministry of Defence leaked that contingency plans were being reviewed. Quiet discussions about how Britain would handle a sudden US military withdrawal. Generals briefed the Prime Minister in hushed tones. Intelligence chiefs warned of Russian opportunism, Chinese cyber infiltration, and the collapse of European morale. NATO, once a symbol of unity, was now described by insiders as a table missing legs. And yet, amid the panic, something else was happening, a rebellion of silence. Senior diplomats, civil servants, and even former prime ministers began calling one another behind closed doors, not to gossip, but to plan, to save what could still be saved. One veteran of the Foreign Office described it later. It was as if the old order realised it might be watching its own funeral. The British press, always hungry for blood, seized the narrative. Tabloids ran front pages screaming, "Trump betrays Britain," and Sunak's gamble backfires. News pundits dissected every frame of Trump's speech, every line of the Prime Minister's reply. Some called it courage, others called it suicide. Outside Westminster, protesters began gathering, waving both Union Jacks and American flags, chanting conflicting slogans. "Stand with Trump," shouted one side. "Defend our sovereignty," yelled the other. Britain wasn't just divided, it was splintering. Then came the leak. Late in the evening, a confidential memo surfaced, reportedly from a high-ranking NATO diplomat, revealing that a secret transatlantic meeting had taken place weeks earlier. In that meeting, Sunak had quietly resisted an American request to double UK defence contributions, arguing that domestic inflation made such spending impossible. Trump had taken it personally. He'd seen it as an insult, as defiance. The clash that erupted publicly had been brewing for months in silence, and now, with the truth exposed, the narrative shifted again. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a showdown. Inside Downing Street, aides whispered about resignations. Foreign Secretary James Cleverly was said to be furious that he hadn't been warned of the escalation. Home Secretary Suella Braverman privately accused the PM of provoking the unprovocable. But others saw opportunity. Hardline Conservatives began framing Sunak's defiance as a moment of patriotic courage. Britain standing tall against American bullying. Overnight, what looked like a crisis began transforming into a political crucible. The dawn that followed felt like the calm before a storm, but the kind of calm that hides thunder just beyond the horizon. In London, the streets were quieter than usual, but tension hummed beneath the surface like electricity in the air. News anchors spoke in hushed tones, newspapers printed in black headlines that screamed of betrayal and brinkmanship. NATO on the edge, Sunak stands alone, Trump calls the shots. Every word carried the weight of fear, pride and uncertainty. What no one knew yet was that behind closed doors, history was about to be rewritten. At 8 a.m. Washington time, Trump called a press conference. Cameras from every major outlet lined up outside the White House. When he walked out, he looked defiant, triumphant, the posture of a man who knew he held the world's attention. The United States will begin reviewing its financial commitment to NATO, he declared, pausing for dramatic effect. And we are considering relocating our European command unless our allies, including the United Kingdom, step up immediately. The words struck like an earthquake. The room erupted in questions, but Trump had already turned his back and walked away. No explanations, no diplomacy, just a single act of political detonation. Within minutes, markets convulsed. The pound slid, European stock exchanges bled red, and global analysts predicted the possible collapse of the longest military alliance in modern history. In London, Downing Street descended into controlled chaos. Advisors barked into phones, military chiefs rushed into meetings, and the Prime Minister stood at the window of his office, watching the flags outside barely move in the still wind. "So this is how it ends," one aide whispered, "with silence and pride." But Sunak wasn't done. He called for an emergency address to the nation, something no British leader had done since the darkest days of the pandemic. That evening, every channel in Britain turned to the same broadcast. The screen cut to the Prime Minister standing alone in front of a Union Jack, his face pale but steady. "My fellow citizens," he began, voice grave and deliberate, "the United Kingdom will never be intimidated into submission. We are a proud, sovereign nation, and we will continue to defend the principles of democracy, freedom and unity." The speech was both a challenge and a plea, defiant enough to stir patriotism, yet careful enough to avoid open war. But the line that followed would become immortalised in headlines for decades. No leader, no matter how powerful, will dictate Britain's destiny. The reaction was instantaneous. The House of Commons erupted with applause from one side and outrage from the other. Across Britain, church bells rang, spontaneous rallies formed in city squares, and social media lit up with one message: #StandWithBritain. Yet even as pride flared, fear lingered. Because in Washington, Trump was already responding. In a late-night Truth Social post, he accused Sunak of grandstanding for weak Europe and declared that America's protection is not a charity. It was now a full-blown confrontation. The world's two most iconic democracies at each other's throats. Behind the public theatre, darker currents were moving. Leaked intelligence suggested that the Pentagon had frozen several joint training exercises with the UK. British generals received instructions to begin independent readiness reviews, a quiet signal to prepare for strategic isolation. Meanwhile, European leaders scrambled to mediate. French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly phoned both men, pleading for calm, but Trump refused to answer. He was relishing the power, watching allies squirm, turning international diplomacy into a one-man show. Then came the twist no one saw coming. In the early hours of the next morning, an encrypted communique arrived at Buckingham Palace directly from Washington. It wasn't addressed to the government or even the Foreign Office. It was addressed to His Majesty King Charles III. The message, later leaked, was short but seismic. "Your Majesty, the alliance stands at risk. We ask for your wisdom in guiding your nation." In that moment, centuries of constitutional restraint collided with raw geopolitical desperation. The king, who had no political power by law, suddenly became the last line of moral authority holding Britain together. What followed was unprecedented. The palace reached out quietly to Washington, bypassing ministers, diplomats and bureaucrats. Through a web of royal envoys, Charles delivered a message to the White House, a message steeped in dignity but edged with warning. History will judge those who divide where unity once prevailed. It was the kind of royal language that carried the weight of centuries. Even Trump, according to sources, paused when briefed on it. For the first time in days, he hesitated. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was more dangerous than thunder. Britain had survived the most dramatic diplomatic crisis in a generation, yet nothing felt stable. The air in Westminster was thick with exhaustion, and something darker, distrust. The Prime Minister's face had become the symbol of defiance, but behind closed doors, even his allies questioned whether his courage had saved the country or brought it to the edge of ruin. Britain's newspapers spoke with a single voice of triumph, but the whispers in corridors told a different story, one of fear, division, and the quiet knowledge that the special relationship had been mortally wounded. In the days that followed, the world pretended to move on. NATO resumed its meetings, the markets began to heal, and officials smiled through clenched teeth for the cameras. But everyone knew that something fundamental had shifted. The invisible thread that bound the Atlantic alliance had frayed. Washington no longer looked to London for guidance. Brussels no longer treated Britain as a bridge between Europe and America. And the British people, proud yet weary, began asking questions no leader wanted to hear. Had Britain become expendable? Had sovereignty come at too high a cost? Inside number 10, Rishi Sunak faced the loneliest days of his career. Advisors who once flattered him now avoided eye contact. His phone calls with foreign leaders grew shorter, more formal. Every statement he made was dissected for signs of weakness. He was, as one insider put it, a man standing in the ruins of victory, yet he refused to bend. In private meetings, he told his ministers that Britain had done what was right, that it had defended its dignity against a bully. But even he knew the truth was more complicated. Diplomacy isn't about pride. It's about trust, and trust, once broken, rarely returns. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Donald Trump basked in the aftermath like a victorious general surveying conquered ground. His speeches grew bolder, his tone more triumphant. "We showed the world who's boss," he declared at a rally, his crowd roaring approval. Yet behind his swagger, Washington insiders whispered of growing unease. The Pentagon was uneasy about the rift. The State Department worried that alienating Britain would weaken the entire Western order. Even America's allies began to doubt whether they could depend on a superpower that turned its allies into enemies for applause. But Trump thrived on that chaos, because to him, politics was never about peace. It was about dominance. Back in Britain, a new kind of unrest began to take shape. Across London, Manchester, Glasgow, protests returned. Not massive, not violent, but constant. Small groups carrying banners that read, "Britain first, not last," and "No to foreign control." Some were angry at Trump, others at Sunak, others simply at a system that seemed to have lost its way. On talk radio, callers argued about loyalty and betrayal, patriotism and survival. The emotional wound of the clash had reopened the oldest British question: was this island still a leader in the world, or just a survivor? Then came the leak that reignited the fire. A classified report surfaced. An intelligence briefing marked top secret NATO internal. It revealed that during the height of the crisis, a faction within Washington had considered moving critical defence operations out of Britain altogether. Air bases, intelligence hubs, strategic assets, all slated for relocation. Though the plan was never approved, the revelation shattered what little confidence remained. The idea that Britain had been seconds away from losing its global role sent shock through Parliament. The Prime Minister called the leak deeply irresponsible. The opposition called it proof of betrayal. And the people called it what it was, terrifying. As tempers flared, the monarchy once again stepped into the shadows of politics. King Charles, now viewed by many as the quiet anchors of the nation, began discreetly meeting with key figures, military leaders, opposition MPs, and even foreign ambassadors. His purpose was not to command, but to remind. The strength of Britain, he said in one private meeting, was never in its power, but in its principle. Those words, later leaked to the press, struck a chord in a world of voice and outrage. They sounded like something forgotten. Dignity. But while the palace sought calm, Westminster prepared for battle. Rumours spread that members of the Prime Minister's party were plotting a leadership challenge, arguing that Sunak's standoff with Trump had isolated Britain economically. The markets, though stabilised, remained fragile. Business leaders demanded reassurance, while opposition MPs called for a parliamentary inquiry into the NATO affair.